2011-2012 there was a peak of mass mobilization, of protest movement, and it was started by the parliamentary election which was held in December 4 of 2011. During almost 2 years, around 15 big, huge rallies took place in Moscow and some other large cities, and also 3 large pro-governmental manifestations which were held in the same day or in the nearby chronologically, in order to compete the protest rallies and to demonstrate the mass support of the current government. The protest against the unfair elections was indeed a protest of the educated people against uneducated power. One of the most important things about this mobilization was the fact that previously, since 1993, during 20 years, street actions in Moscow and other large Russian cities counted only hundreds of persons. So, when after the elections, the parliamentary elections of December 4, 2011, thousands of people spontaneously came to the street, it was considered as an extraordinary event, and it provoked a high level of reflection, of spontaneous and immediate reflection about what is going to happen further. And one of the motives which was implemented in these discussions was the motive of the revolution. Should this event turn into a popular uprising and the change of regime, and if we can count that this change would not be a revolution. So one of the reasons, one of the major motives of the first phase of the first month of the mobilization consisted in fact of denial of the revolution. So one of the dimensions of this mobilization consisted in fact in a concurrence for media coverage, for media representation of street actions, for street activities. What was the most important things maybe which could orient you in understanding this protest? First, as I said, it was mass. It was not like hundreds of thousands of participants. Normally, the participation varied from 5,000 to 60,000. It was more or less realistic as evaluation of the participation, while it's always, as you know, the concurrence between the police, which gives quite low numbers like 3,000, and at the same time the organizers give like 120,000. The other point, which is most important, is the fact that by contrast to world movements which marked the same period of 2011-2012 in the world, the Russian mobilization didn't touch 2 major subjects which were represented in other cases, like in Arab societies or in Brazil, in Europe, in the United States, and recently in Ukraine. So the first subject was not touched, at least on the public level, on the public scene of the mobilization, was the social justice. There was no problematization about the rich and the poor, 1 and 99%, and only a small faction of left activists tried to bring these problematics into public agenda of the manifestations, but in a localized and autonomous way. And the second point, which was important as a difference to mostly European and North American movements, was the absence, the lack of the critique of the representative democracy. So what was the main point of Indignados or of Occupy movement was almost totally absent in the Russian case, and on the contrary, in Russia, the mobilization started with a critique of unfair elections. So the main slogan which remained on the public scene in between two elections, the parliamentary elections in December 2011 and presidential elections in March 2012, was a slogan for fair elections, re-elections in order to re-establish the stolen, the falsified votes. Maybe another point, which is also very important to understand the Russian case, the Russian mobilization, consisted in fact that finally during this almost 2 years of mobilization, the protest movement didn't use the constitutive violence in order to install a new government, a new order, or to reverse the current government. As I said, the beginning of the mobilization was clearly marked by the debate about the non- or revolutionary character of the movement, and the basis of the debate consisted in fact of identification between revolution and pointless violence, the bloodshed. The group which was created, a research group, a mixed research group which was created in the end of December 2011, and which started to go to the streets and interview anonymously the participants of the protest movement, discovered quite quickly several, one may say, hidden dimensions of this mobilization. So, as I said, the public agenda of the protest was formed by the slogans like fair election, demission of the government and of the head of the electoral commission, so of everyone who were implied in the falsifications. But what was one of the most interesting points of the whole mobilization consisted in fact that in interviews the protest participants were defining themselves in a clear opposition of civilized and cultivated people against uncultivated, rude and coarse power. And that was represented, that was articulated in various manners, starting from self-definition, social self-definitions, giving sense to me educated, and going up to sense of going out to streets. So in some of the interviews, you could find the motivation that we came here in order to say no to this coarse, rude and uncultivated power. Following our interviews, which was not enormous, we all, in total, we had at around 500 interviews in the streets during these 2 years. But not only based on our interviews, crossing data with some other research groups and polling centers, we found out that maybe the only thing which we may say about the protesters was the overrepresentation of people seeking university diploma. It was like about between 65 to 75% of the participants. A basic parameter which permitted people to protest consisted did not consist in fact that they had a clear class appartenance, a clear class belonging. It was not a professional base which could explain a uniform or a similar set of models of activities of going out to streets. It consisted in fact that these were people who were governing their own lives in some or another way. First, people from the private sector reported about search of job and conducting their own strategies in order to find a place in the labor market. People who were whose professional origin was connected to academic studies, sometimes were referring to academic freedoms and the freedom of research and freedom of thinking, and some others who didn't belong to some special professional group were people who had an experience of volunteering, of charity, of different types of non-political, associate and private activities of helping someone else, or of organizing some autonomous initiative like rock concerts, street art, things like that. So one of the main explanations I could extract from these interviews and from the study is that people who came to the streets were already in some way empowered by their previous experience of organizing their own lives. And one of the main challenges they felt, and this was one of the motivations when they went to the street, consisted in fact that they saw the falsified elections, but also the previous gestures of the current government as a threat to their autonomy, to their personal, familial, and professional autonomy. Could we still turn back to the point that the protest was conducted by the middle class? I would say that the construction in itself, the fact that the protest was called, was baptized, the revolution or the revolt of the middle class, was a very highly and clearly constructed mediatic construction, which was realized before the mass protest started. And this is quite an interesting feature of the whole protest, where the media play the role of the main agency which tries to define publicly, especially for those who did not participate in the protest, of what was going on. So, if in the media high interest and high mobilization, symbolic mobilization in favor of the middle class could be noticed, in blogs it was not at all the case. And this data was confirmed exactly by the interviews where people were asked not with a direct question about the belonging to the middle class, but with an open question to what social strata, group or class they refer themselves. And this was quite revealing, because they were, among these 500 interviews, there were only around 3,000 of interviews, about 30 interviews, which were referring, where the people were referring to middle class, were defining themselves spontaneously as middle class. But they also made some very important corrections to the way they were defining that. So I will read you two short citations about how the people felt themselves, middle or not. One of them, a translator of 55, the age of 55, says, maybe purely theoretically we are the middle class. And another, a manager in public relations, age of 25, says, I hope to place myself in middle class, but to tell the truth, I have a vague idea of what it is. So, here and in some other interviews and some other manifestations of the protesters, we may see a direct impact of the media presence, which defined the protest before the protest started, and then the participants started to dialogue in some way with this etiquette, which was attached with the label, which was attached and attributed to them. Unless this media work, media construction about the social constitution of the middle class, of the protest as a middle class, still there is a theoretical and practical interest in defining socially this mobilization, because it was not clearly electoral unless the public agenda which it proposed for the fair elections. It was not clearly social because it rejected to speak publicly about social justice and some other socially related issues like social assistance or taxes. The Russian protest was not at all prepared routinely by the structures which preceded the protest. I mean, there was no a network of trade union or of political party organizations which conducted a discussion before the protest started. There was no a network of local city or district units which could be the place of reflection about the current political situation. And neither the parties, I mean the legal parliamentary parties, could not provide such a discussion because in many cases they were clearly dependent from the government, and in most cases the distrust to institutional politics and especially to parliamentary parties was critically high among the protesters as among the whole population. So the protest did not start in the pre-existing institutional or networking structures, and as an effect, people who were going out to the streets were going out individually with their friends or with their families. So the trajectory of going out to the street was completely different of this type of mass mobilization, which is well known in European societies and which makes part of these established studies of social movements. Most part of the participants were going out in the weekend to protest, and they were going back to be reintegrated into professional and everyday rhythms which were not changed by the protest experience. Following the interviews, there were only a small faction which counted dozens of individuals whose lifestyles or social trajectories were changed by the protest experience. For the most part of them, it was just reintegrating, turning back to normal habitual activities. The protest didn't leave after itself any stable structures, any representative structures, any institutions or networks which could embrace a visible part of the participants. Still, it lasted during 2 years, and now it is reactivated with new reasons of the Russian military presence in the Ukraine. So one of the questions which is really intriguing is if people went to the streets, they had a special experience, but still it didn't change much their lives, the lifestyles, institutional life, professional life, what they were doing there all the time, why they were getting back again to the streets. First of all, as I said, the protest brought a cultural, a cultivated, a civilizational in some way character in strict opposition to the rude coarse, uncivilized power. So that was not a protest which was based on institutionally motivated promotion of one or another candidate to parliamentary elections. And what was the most interesting for the participants following the interviews was not a parliamentary game in itself, but was a disempowerment of the monopolists, of Putin and his government, and parties depending from the current government, from their monopoly in the institutional space. So it was a kind of game which did not reject the distrust into political institutions, but which was using quite actively this distrust, and which was creating a space of belonging, of experience, of some historical gesture which was realized without being attached institutionally or without giving a credit of confidence to any of the political figures represented in the public scene. So one of the results of this protest was that the protesters started from denial of institutional representation without making a critique of the representative democracy, and on the contrary, making a support of the representative democracy for fair functioning. But they finished in more or less the same state of distanciation themselves from the institutions. And several attempts to create the protest representation inside the movement were more or less successfully sabotaged by the most part of the participants. If you recognize some symbolics of the Russian activist groups, you may see that in the same space the far left, far right and radical liberal activists were neighbors and allies, which is not at all the case of any European or North American movement. So in some way the protest generated a feeling of unity, of this primordial unity, which precedes any artificially implemented political cleavages. And the fact that all of us, democratically, far right, far left, and all the people who didn't belong to any political party are here together in the street, was appreciated by some of the participants in the interviews in an explicit manner. So in some way we may see a revival of a mythology of this original political unity, but that original unity was not marked neither ethnically nor politically. It was just the primordial one. Finally, everything which could englobe this experience consisted in another opposition, which some of them pronounced quite explicitly, and this opposition was the normality of private life practices and professional practices that they were exercising already, and abnormality of the political order with all these falsifications, violent police, non-functioning institutions, etc. So one of the driving motivations which brought people to the streets was a kind of temptation to test themselves, to make a self-trial of us who are normals against this abnormal political order. Different forms of protest and also things which could not be expected from protesters in the interviews were explained and could be explained by this self-trial, self-test against the abnormal political order by normal people. And this portion, this motivation of normality brought to the streets, paradoxically to the protest, gave a big sense to what was happening in the street. So in some way it was quite incredible to hear from people who went to change something, presumably, in the streets, to hear that what they wished the most and how they saw the change consisted in the fact that it was already doing in their ordinary life, maybe improving some moral or ethical attitude towards the others. And it could be seen as a funny feature, but in the logic I explained, without any preliminary preparation given by the subjacent structures of parties, trade unions or associations, with this clear opposition between cultivated individuals and uncultivated power, and finally with the reintegration into ordinary life, which was clearly opposed to institutional representation, false and corrupted. It's quite clear that the empowerment people had from for going out to the streets came from the sense of normality, which they already had, and which was confirmed by their professional success, by their education, and by the only sector of social life they reported to be able to control themselves, the family life. So one among the others of the features of this strange logic of empowerment consisted in fact that finally the protest was not a protest, and it is not still a protest for a radical change in the contemporary Russian society, but in most part it's a protest for an optimal stability as opposed to the corrupt stability of the governing regime.